please make sure you go over to YouTube, subscribe, or you can always find us on any of the podcast platforms, and that's Fostering Change. Well, it's so hard to believe that as we have gone through the year, there's so many amazing things that we can talk about when it comes to adoption and foster care. When I first started this podcast 3 seasons ago, I was kind of concerned that I wasn't going to be able to have enough content to go season after season. And now we're in season 3, and I am so excited about my next guest. I was actually telling David, our producer, that it's so great when you get to interview someone who you consider your friend. My friend Marcy has done so many amazing things. And by the way, there are things that I didn't even realize she did that we're going to all talk about. But ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Marcy Bursac. Marcy, welcome to Fostering Change.
Thank you. And hello, everyone. I'm so thrilled to be here. It's nice to finally talk with the camera on to one another. It's such a treat.
Yeah, so we started this last season where people wanted to see our guest, and I'm an animated person as it is, so they wanted to definitely see us. So we do have a YouTube channel that we actually air this. Again, everybody can listen to it on all the podcast platforms, but I love the fact that I get to see you and they get to see you and we get to talk. Listen, I want to dive right in. The Forgotten Adoption Option. This book, I actually read this book. It's an easy read, everybody, by the way, just to let you know, it's an easy read, but what an education tool that I think people need to know about. Because when Reese and I decided to start the journey, I should say, we had no knowledge whatsoever. We did not know anything when it came to adopting through foster care, and you actually gave this a manual. So what made you decide to write this?
Well, and it's interesting. So if people like to read, they can read. I actually have it in an audiobook format. So anywhere, whether it's your library or Apple or whoever you listen to audiobooks on, even on Audible, it's in 90 minutes. So I've had many people that are like, Marcy, I just sat down for the afternoon. But what happened is in the midst of the pandemic, for whatever reason, I became keenly aware of marketing all around me, because I guess we all were kind of only on our screens, right? There wasn't really real life happening in the old way. And I started getting really frustrated that I wasn't seeing marketing for the children that were like mine, that were like yours, that were waiting to be adopted. And I just kind of was shaking my fist, someone should do something about this. It's such a missed opportunity. And after, I guess, a couple of weeks of that spun into maybe I should do something. And so I had been having conversations, Rob, and maybe this has happened to you as someone that adopted through foster care. My husband and I were told it was a 4-month process once our kids were with us. At month 9, it was going nowhere and there was no end in sight. And I thought, well, why on earth did I elect to adopt? I could have done this biologically and had a very different outcome at 9 months potentially, right? And so at that time, we had blogged what we were going through as a way to be maybe this is why it's supposed to take forever. And so we had 2 ground rules: no bad talking in the bio family, and we're not going to disclose why our kids were in care. We felt like those weren't details that were fair for us to be the ones to communicate, right? And so in the process, we had a lot of interest, and friends and family and people that we didn't know would reach out and say, hey, since I know you did this, can you teach me how? So pre-pandemic, you'd come in my home for an hour or two, I'd spill the whole thing. It felt like I was barfing 54 steps, okay, follow this whole instruction guide, right? But Rob, time and time again, people left my home and they went and did it. And so it was they just didn't know how. And so during the pandemic, I thought, well, I had a few of those visits, but they were virtual like this again. But I was like, how do I scale this? There are way more kids to help. That it's 115,000 right now, right? And so I decided to give myself the goal of writing it in a month, because I had kind of started 2 years prior and never finished. And 25 days later, I had the manuscript. And what was really wonderful about it is I had a new neighbor move in. And as we got acquainted, I explained I adopted my kids through foster care. I'm very open about that, because I think that's a great way to recruit others to learn about it and tell their friends, right? And she said, well, I'd love to learn how to do that. Can you teach me? And I said, you can be one of my editors. And so I got to write it to someone that had no idea any of the system and the vocabulary. And so that's kind of how it became what it is. And what's cool, Rob, is now I've had families, whether they're motivated by infertility or this is what they wanted to do, whatever the story has been that's kind of led them to foster care adoption. I had a couple, I love this, they're almost licensed, they're about to get matched with their children. And they said, Marcy, did you know that we've been having dinner together for the past month? And I was like, no, I didn't know that we've been having dinner together. And they said, your book has been sitting on our table. And so every night at dinner, as we've gone through class, as we've gone through our assignments to get licensed, we flipped through the book because you told us exactly what to do. You told us what was next. You told us what was going to happen. And they were like, we've just had this companion with us this whole time to help us know what to do. Because, Rob, you've been through this. It's hard to know what's next, and it's not really a written formula, but I kind of sifted that out and made it into something that you could rinse and repeat.
Yeah, I definitely will have to tell you, Marcy, I was pretty impressed with, how you did lay it out step by step. How long ago did you and your husband start the process with your children?
Well, okay, the short answer is my daughter is 10, almost 11, and we got licensed, or I should say we met each other when she was almost 3, so about 7 years ago.
10 years.
However, to me, I think, Rob, what really has motivated, even like, why do I care about this space? Why do I care about sharing the how? Well, one, there's more children than I could possibly ever adopt. But two, when my husband and I got married, even before we got married, we talked about family expansion. And I said, hey, it might be a deal breaker. I really want to adopt. I've gone overseas. I've seen orphanages. And he said, I do too. My grandfather at age 7 was orphaned and never got adopted. And so we shared this commonality. And he said, I have one request, and that's that the children be from the United States. And I was like, I have no idea how to do this, because our heart was to get non-babies, like to get older kids. So Rob, really for me, it was, well, it took us 5 years to figure out, like, where do you even, how do you even do that? Right? Like, where do you get started? And then to find out that the cost of it is really affordable. It's $0 to $2,500 a kid, where most people think I could never adopt. It's so expensive. Well, some methods like international and infant adoption are tens of thousands of dollars, but foster care adoption is highly affordable.
So, I have to throw the first wrench into the conversation, because that was not our experience. For my husband and I, 13 years ago, when we decided to be parents, we wanted to adopt. I wanted to adopt overseas, by the way, as a kid who grew up in the foster care system. I did not want, as I would say to my husband, one of those kids. My husband reminded me that I was one of those kids, and he's really smart, by the way, compared to me. And so we ended up having our first 2 children arrive, and 3 months later, we had 2 more children arrive. But it ended up costing us a little over $65,000 to adopt our children. I'm very open about it in our book. And that was because we were 2 white gay men trying to adopt 4 children of color. And what I love is that I'm talking to people who now are experiencing what my husband and I experienced, and that's not the way it is any longer. So I'm so happy to see that you are right where it's that 0 to 25. But I want people to know, as you've read my book, A Forever Family, that, it wasn't like that for us. And I do have to say something. I want to back up, because something that you said that if I regret doing, and I have said this in public forum, I did write a memoir. I told my children as I was writing my memoir, and my publishers and stuff were, we were writing it. I did talk about my children, about their experience and how they came in. And now that my kids are in that teenage year, not that any of them have said, Dad, I wish you wouldn't have shared that part of my life. I do feel a little guilt. So I love that you said, keep how they came into the system out of, the way you talk about it. I love that.
But Rob, so much of parenting is trial and error, right? Like, we don't know. I mean, to put my children, they're on the back of my book. It's a family photo. I asked them in advance. They were very young when that came, because their peer group at school didn't know. They were adopted before they entered the grade school system. And what I loved is my son, who's a very compassionate child, just looked at me and said, Mom, if I say it's okay to put my face on the back, do you think that somebody might adopt a child because they'll see me? And I was like, yeah, because when you can see someone else do it, it normalizes it, right? He was like, well, then by all means, I want my photo on the back.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's exactly what my kids were like too, by the way. So when their chapter was being written, we set them down and we talked to them about it. And my kids were exactly like your son. They were like, if it's going to help one child, one child get adopted, then you know what? It's worth us telling our story. You know, you're part of the Dave Thomas Foundation, and Rita is a friend of mine, and I love the fact that you're one of the ambassadors there. And by the way to go, Mrs. Ohio, Miss, you know, Miss America. When the heck do you find time for all this? You're also Miss America, Mrs. Ohio from the
Well,
America.
sort of. So I'm okay. This gets a little, the pageantry system has all sorts of flavors. So my
Okay.
technical title is United States of America's Mrs. Ohio. So it's a different system, but yeah, I am an ambassador for the Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption. My work with the foundation was like 2014. My husband and I are trying to figure out, okay, we're going through licensing classes. How are we getting time off of work to do this? Like, are we going to have to exhaust the paid time off they already gave us? What are we supposed to do? And we Googled at the time and found Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption had templates that we could customize and present to our employer. Hi, I'd like to have some support here. I'd like to have time off, maybe some money, depending upon how things unfolded. So it was kind of a natural progression when I wrote the Forgotten Adoption option in my 1 month of focus. One of my goals was, okay, if I'm going to do this the way that could be a big, scary goal, what would I want to do? And I put the Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption high on, I want to talk to them about an endorsement. And so Rita was very excited to provide that and very supportive at the time. It was very out of the box. I know that like this random mom who adopted kids wanting to do this is different. But then what happened last summer, Rob, I did not grow up doing pageantry. I have worked in like the nonprofit arena for Dress for Success. So I've spent time in like that space, not in get dressed up, wear swimsuit and heels. Like that's not my DNA. But what happened last summer, Rob, is I was on the brink of leaving for vacation. And again, like my frustration of like, why isn't someone doing this, is I was like, okay, now that I've got this book and this wonderful way to help teach people as a, you know, all across the nation, this can go everywhere, and it has, which is amazing. But how do I change the perception? And you said it earlier, like, I don't want one of those kids, right? And I'm like, there's some, you know, there's a little bit of truth to that in some ways. There are some behavioral things. The research shows that. The research shows adoption is full of that. Like, that's just part of what happens. But I wanted to figure out a way to kind of rebrand what a foster child is. Like, how do we help give these children the dignity and the respect that they deserve, and the potential that if you or I, and you were one of them, like, but if I was one of these children, I would want people to look at me with potential and not, you know, write me off. And so it was at that point that I just felt like I was supposed to look into the pageant system, which is super wild. And then I asked the Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption. I said, look, I know I live in Missouri, you're in Ohio, I have this opportunity. And they said, Marcy, do they understand you don't live here? And I was like, oh, I'm very aware. And I've told my friends and family, I thought they'd call me crazy. No one did. They're all very, very supportive. And Rob, surprisingly, the foundation told me no one has ever done this before, yeah. Which I think is such an incredible opportunity of like, how do you take a message to a positive light, right? So I've really enjoyed that journey and being able to partner in even deeper ways, because we've been doing stuff since 2014. So we're just doing like another way to spread the work. Is the data, I don't know if you know this, the Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption had a research study come out this year from Harris Poll. And one of the key takeaways that I find really much an opportunity is that it showed only about 50% of adults are even aware that there's a need to adopt children from foster care. And from what I've been doing in the community and around the nation, I think part of what is a challenge to that is that people think of foster child through one lens, and they think, oh, these are kids that need a temporary place to go and they're going to move back with their biological family. And that's where the Forgotten Adoption option falls in, because there's a second definition, right? There's the, I'm a child, I'm in a foster home because legally the state is my parent and I need someone to adopt me, or I'm going to age out. And I think that's where there's a huge opportunity, is to help inform our nation that like there are kids that need us.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I'm so lucky. Rita was just on my podcast for, I think, the second time. She's such a good friend of mine, and I absolutely love her. And we're actually honoring her this October at our backyard barbecue. She's receiving the Barbara Harrison Award because she's so driven, and she's just so passionate. And, you know, and you are right, Marcy. I mean, the biggest thing that I've noticed, and I'm like you, I didn't come from the nonprofit world. I'm a .com guy who, you know, all of a sudden find out that, you know, wait a minute, you know, what's going on here when it comes to kids in foster care? First thing I have to tell you, and I say this to all my guests, I think the biggest issue that we have is that we have to change the vocabulary. The problem is when I say the word foster and I say the word foster child, the first thing that someone thinks of is bad. They think that a child's been put in a situation of something they did, drugs, they think. And so what we've tried to do is try to change the narrative where we call these children who are in foster care. Because when you say the word child, your heart warms up a little bit. And so, but I will tell you, I have some really young Miss Teens and Miss, Shenandoah Valley and all this, and they are starting to take the platform of our organization, Cover Cases, and the platform of foster care in general. Because I'll tell you right now, the way this is going to change is children helping children. Okay.
Absolutely.
Children and doing what you and I are doing. Listen, I want to take a quick break because there are some things I've highlighted in the book that I want you and I to talk about. And it's things that my guests know that I love to talk about because I think we all need to really understand when it comes to foster care. But before we take that quick break, I have to say, Marcy, Little Bird was one of my favorite books as a kid. Okay. And you talk about Little Bird, about that, or Who's My Mother?
Are You My Mother? Yep.
Yeah,
you are my Little Bird. Yeah.
And I literally in my mind can etch, because growing up in the system, wanting that mom figure so bad, that to me, I will never forget that. Listen, everybody, we're going to be right back. We're going to continue this amazing conversation. The book is The Forgotten Adoption Option. Listen, I've had so many of you reach out to me and you ask me questions about foster care, adoption through foster care. I just had an email just the other day. This is it, guys. I'm telling you, The Forgotten Adoption Option. It is literally going to answer all the questions that you're going to need. And if you cannot find the answer, she gives you the resources where you can find it. So, again, there's nothing I love more than a great conversation. And I remind each and every one of us that how we make a change within our community and our community of children in foster care is doing what my friend Marcy and I are doing today. And that's to talk about it. The fact that our friend Rita had actually done with the Dave Thomas Foundation, they had done this research and finding out that, 50% of people don't even realize that children in care actually need permanent placement. When Alex arrived in our home at the age of 18, Marcy, one of the things I remember saying to the court systems is that, somebody asked me, why would I take a child in at the age of 18? And I reminded this person that every single child deserves a foundation. Every single child deserves to know that they are loved. And every single child deserves a forever family,
You do, because life doesn't end at 18, right? There's all these milestones in just life, like 18 to 80, somewhere in there. There's a lot of life there.
Let me tell you something. My son is now 21 years old, and he will be the first one to say, I can't imagine my life without my pops and my dada. And so, listen, I want to jump right into the book because there was one particular thing that you put in the book that I will have to tell you gave me a little thorn in my side. I'm going to bring it up. I love to disagree to agree because we all see something differently. So when I was a young kid in the system, their respite was back in those days as well. By the way, respite's been around forever. And when my children arrived from the system, we had respite. And we were always asked to use respite. And the more research I did, I remember what it felt like to be a little kid. So I want to put you into a situation and not ever growing in the system I can't imagine you and your husband actually used respite. But, the bio family would want to go on vacation and they would take me and drop me off at the respite house. Or, and I hear this from kids all over the country. I meet kids everywhere. And one of the things that hurt their heart so much is respite, because all of a sudden they've been put into this family who they think is their family. And then all of a sudden they find out that they're going on vacation. And because our courts are so antiquated and we can't take kids past 50 miles and they all of a sudden go to another stranger's house. I don't think respite should happen.
So I never said respite should happen. I just showcased that it's a possibility.
That you didn't, by the way. I have to give her credit, everybody. She did not, when you read this, she was just educating us about it. You were educating. I want to know how you feel about it.
Well, so what's interesting is I became aware of respite because my husband and I, so just in case people are joining and they're like, Rob, I don't have any idea what we're talking about. So real quick, respite is meant to give a family that's fostering children that are foster care, 1 to 14 overnight kind of ability for them to have a break, right? By being with a different family that's licensed through respite, a respite provider. And what happened was when my husband and I were nearing the licensing process to adopt through foster care, our licensing worker said, hey, I know like you've nannied a lot, and I know your husband's an elementary school teacher, so clearly you have a lot of experience with kids, but on paper, you don't have children. So we need you to get some parenting experience. So it was pitched to us as, please go do this, so that on paper, we can say you did this. But we got really, really lucky, and we ended up, we had 2 different times, actually 3 different times, 2 different families. There were 2 boys that we helped one time, a 4 and an 8-year-old, and then a young man that was 5. And we were a respite provider. But again, coming from like the space of having nanny, and in my book, I even share all the questions we asked. Like we wanted to be as repeatable to the process. So kind of back to your point, Rob, of like, this can be a traumatic and unpositive experience. I think the reality is, if you kind of zoom out of that, I mean, in general, any of us can grow up in kind of a healthy and positive, or unhealthy and not positive, so it's kind of the full gradient's there. And I'm sorry for your experience. I like to think, I mean, the boys that we cared for, the one gentleman that was 5, he was in that process of getting adopted by a relative across state lines, so he couldn't go. And we loved it. Although my husband at that point was like, since we've only been breastfeeding for 1 child, I think we should adopt 1. And I was like, no. We're doing siblings. Like, that is clear. If you're going to do up to 2, we're doing them together. And the 2 boys that we did respite for, we've actually, we took them to church with us that weekend. And we learned as they walked into the kids' classroom that the teacher there was a preschool teacher, like at their school, like she knew them, like she called them by name. And we were like, what? So we ended up like having this beautiful connection. That woman ended up becoming one of my mentors. She also fosters, she's a single mom. So we've had really positive relationships. The family that had the 2 boys ended up adopting them. We've been in each other's lives. So I had a very
I love that.
flavor.
Those are the stories I want to hear. Those are the stories I want our listeners to hear, because I have not had really nice things to say about respite. Once people say things based on the experience that they have gone through.
Sure. Right?
And they also say things based on the fact of people that you meet and the children that I've met. And, I remember when my kids were little and the adoption process had not happened yet, and we wanted to take our kids to Disney World, and immediately the birth parents said no. And even though we knew they weren't getting their children back, because we were so far into the process, we had to go in front of a judge. And we had to get a judge to place the order to allow our children to go to Disney World. And now as adult, older, 13 years has passed, I understand the reason why they said no. I truly understand the reason why they say no. And what would have happened to us, we just wouldn't have gone to Disney World, by the way.
Sure, it's a process. But I will say real quick, one more note on respite, and to your point, because you're like, I would think you didn't use that. Well, I didn't use respite, I think, in the terms of, I didn't just go to a random person to take care of my children. There was a point where my husband and I wanted to take an anniversary trip just across state. And we wanted someone to care for our kids, but when your kids are technically in the state's custody still, you can't just leave them with a relative. And so I recruited my dad, who kindly underwent the training. It was all online, so he became a respite provider. But I'll tell you, Rob, I mean, I remember being on the phone with my dad during that trip for like a solid hour, where he was the behaviors, it was very different than anything he had ever been exposed to.
Right. No, let me tell you something. We actually did the same exact thing you did. And so I did not consider that respite. I considered that, just like so many other families where, and for our case, Mima and Papa came in and to give, because you gotta understand, we had 4 kids under the age of 4 within 3 months. And what I find kind of humorous is that you made the comment about how they wanted you to do it because you didn't have any parenting experience. Could you imagine my husband and I? I mean, here we are, 2 gay men living in DC in the city. And, changing a diaper wasn't even something I even thought about. And all of a sudden, the next thing you know, we have 4 kids, and
And yet people become parents every day without any of the training. Like it works. It's
exactly.
okay.
Exactly. And I love the fact that you brought up with your kids were with your dad, about how your dad was on the phone because of behaviors. And I'm 55, and there are still times that something will trigger me from what I experienced as a kid that was in the system, and understanding that trauma can hit a child at any time. I want to jump back into the book for a second, because one of the things that I absolutely loved is that you did a lot of definitions for different things, whether it was the parent, whether it was the child. You really, made this as granular as possible for the things that, for me as an adoptive parent, that I was thinking about. And I want to tell you, when I read this book, I said this to you earlier. There was nothing like this when I was a kid growing up, and there was nothing like this when my husband and I decided to have children. And this would have opened our eyes in so many things. But since you are so deep within the system and knowing the system, I want to ask you, there is something that's happening quite a bit as we see children who are being adopted out of foster care, and it's reactive attachment disorder. It's always been around, but it's been very, very prevalent in the last 3 to 4 years. Have you worried about that with your children?
So reactive attachment disorder, in case folks aren't familiar, it's also called RAD. So it almost sounds like a color red, but it's not. My husband and I knew we wanted to adopt older children. So we did it in addition to the typical licensing process. We did, I think they call it elevated needs. So we got additional training on it. In our state, they called it an invisible suitcase. And that is that a child, and sort of like to Comfort Case's point, it's invisible. It's not just a suitcase, it's invisible, that children bring with them, right? These things they've gone through. And to your point, it can trigger at any age, right? My children have certainly gone through different behavior issues. Has that sometimes been some attachment and reactive attachment? Absolutely. My kids at the time when we adopted them, well, we met at age 3 and 4 and then adopted a calendar year later. So at 4 and 5. And it's been really interesting, Rob. And as a family, we talk this all the time, is just this stark difference that the two of them had. My daughter went into care at 6 months old. So she doesn't really remember stability ever, and doesn't really remember a lot of the details about what she was around. Whereas my son remembers going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And to him, and putting words to it as he's getting older, right? That he always thought he was going to go back because that's what he thought. That was a kid, you think as a kid. And so I think for him, some of those issues have been stronger because he just had this strong desire that he was going this way instead of that way. And I think it's hard, Rob. I mean, I didn't grow up in the foster care system, but one of my intentions with my book is really to help people understand the perspective of these kids. And I call it a lot of really big words that are terms for fears and just different things we're thinking that we might not put words to, right? And I think so much of that is even going with reactive attachment disorder, understanding, why is this happening? This isn't my kid hating me. This isn't my kid doesn't want to be grateful or adopted. I mean, so many people are like, aren't your kids grateful? And it's like, we don't go into this for our kids to be like, thank you so much. Like, that's just a kid, right? But it certainly is part of the story. I mean, I think I, for one, would be mad at times that I was adopted. I think I would be mad to not have choice in that. And I would be angry at the choices people made that impacted me, right? And so I understand and I empathize with it. Is it real? It is absolutely real, but I think unpacking it and fostering really good open conversation over our lifetimes to talk through those things and get the professional help, whether it's through a psychologist or psychiatrist, play therapy, all those things we've utilized for sure, has been really helpful just in unpacking the reality of what it is to be adopted from foster care.
Yeah, and I will tell you, I love my therapist. I see him every Monday, and he's helped me get through a lot. And like my children, who all have also, and I do have a son who suffers from RAD, and it did come out at a later stage. And it's so interesting. You're the first adopted foster parent I've met who actually had the same experience I did, where I had a sibling group, 6 months old, 3 months old, the youngest one came in, but my other son, he remembers being the boomerang kid, and how different the two of them are. I totally get that. Listen, everybody, the book is The Forgotten Adoption Option. Okay, you have options. Each and every one of us have an option of how we build our family. Okay, we truly do. And we need to know that 115,000, just sink that in, that are children who are waiting for a forever family. So for those of you who have called me and said, well, I'm worried about the bio parents coming and yanking the kid back after I adopted them. No, listen. You have options, okay? You have options with this book. Marcy, you have another book that's out, which my husband and I are so honored to be in. When it is like, it's so crazy. Look at this. This is,
Aren't you guys adorable?
This is the greatest picture. I love that my husband has had it printed out and he's having it framed. And we are just so proud to say that you and I are family when it comes to this, because I do believe that when you become a foster parent or you adopt through foster care, you do, enlarge your family. And you should take advantage of those. Listen, everybody, again, the forgotten adoption option, we'll have the link on our Facebook page, on all of our social media platforms. I want you to get educated about this, but don't worry, Marcy will be back in November, because we are truly going to talk about her new children's book, because truly what I said to Alex, and I say to my kids, and I say to everybody, every child deserves a forever family. Until next time, we'll talk again.
Hi, everyone.
Hey everybody, it's Rob Scheer, the founder of Comfort Cases, and thanks for tuning in to Fostering Change. You can actually watch a couple of episodes right here